The icy breath of St. Petersburg wrapped around the city that night like a ghost. Midnight had come and gone, and while most of Russia's northern capital lay under a silent blanket of frost, one lavish palace in the heart of the city pulsed with a secret purpose. Its chandeliers glimmered. Its grand dining room was being carefully staged, not for a gala, not for visiting royalty, but for the final hours of one man's life. Inside, hands worked with a cold precision, slipping poison into cakes and swirling it into glasses of wine. Their guest of honor, a man both feared and worshipped, was on his way, unaware that every smiling face waiting for him belonged to someone plotting his death. That man was Grigory Rasputin, the mystical peasant-turned-healer who had clawed his way from the frozen soil of Siberia into the warm, glittering center of Russian power. He was the trusted confidant of the Empress herself, the shadow behind the throne, and, to many, the most hated man in all of Russia. But before his name became a whisper of scandal in palace corridors and a headline in defiant newspapers, Rasputin was just another villager living an ordinary life. He worked the land, married, fathered children, and seemed destined to vanish into the anonymity of rural Russia until something inside him shifted. At 28, the pull of religion gripped him like a fever. He abandoned his family and home, setting out on an endless pilgrimage. Town after town, village after village, he gathered followers who hung on his every word, prayed with him, and swore that his touch could heal. Whether it was true or not mattered little. People believed, and belief is its own kind of power. By 1905, his reputation had reached a near-mythic status. And then came the invitation that would change his life forever. The Empress of Russia needed him. Her son, the young heir, was dying from hemophilia. Doctors had failed him. Medications offered no relief. Rasputin told her to stop the treatments and prayed over the boy. Against all odds, the bleeding stopped. To the Empress, it was nothing short of a miracle. From that day on, Rasputin was not just welcome in the palace. He was indispensable. She sought his counsel constantly, trusting him over ministers, generals, even her own husband. And in the eyes of the Russian elite, this illiterate holy man had ascended far too high. But behind his saintly image was a man with appetites. He drank heavily, indulged in endless affairs, and filled his nights with women, both his followers and prostitutes, while rumors of orgies and debauchery swirled through the city. Police surveillance reports painted a damning portrait. Rasputin staggering home at dawn, women slipping in and out of his apartment, drunken singing echoing through the night. Still, his influence over the Empress and, by extension, the Tsar only grew. Soon he wasn't just whispering spiritual advice, he was shaping political decisions, replacing ministers, and voicing opinions on Russia's role in the war. The public's patience snapped. To them, the royal family was being puppeteered by a corrupt, lecherous fraud. Newspapers, despite strict censorship, began risking fines just to print the stories. And in November 1916, inside the Russian parliament, politician Vladimir Perishkovich voiced what many had been whispering. Rasputin had to be stopped. In the audience that day was Prince Felix Yusupov, a man of immense wealth and royal blood who despised Rasputin with a burning hatred. That speech was the spark. Days later, Yusupov and Perishkovich met in secret and decided they would be the ones to end Rasputin's life. The plan was meticulous. Joining them were Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Dr. Stanislaus Lazarevert and Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin. They would lure Rasputin to Yusupov's palace with the promise of meeting Yusupov's young wife, Irina, a beauty Rasputin had been pestering to meet for weeks. The bait was irresistible. The palace basement was transformed into a luxurious private dining room, its thick walls perfect for containing the sound of a gunshot. Cakes and wine would be laced with cyanide, enough to kill a man in minutes. Once Rasputin was dead, they would destroy his clothes, dump his body through a hole in the frozen Neva River, and vanish into the night. On December 29th, the trap was set. The streets outside were hushed under a brutal winter chill. Inside the palace, Dr. Lazarevert shredded cyanide into the icing of pink cakes and poured it into goblets of wine. Upstairs, gramophone music played, a staged illusion of a party in progress. Rasputin, at his apartment, dressed for the evening, already boasting to his daughter and secretary about where he was going, despite promising secrecy. Shortly after midnight, Yusupov arrived to escort him. Rasputin stepped into the palace, unaware that upstairs the conspirators were listening for the sounds of his last breaths. But as the minutes dragged on, tension mounted. Rasputin refused the food. He sipped the wine slowly, chatting casually, his piercing gaze locked on Yusupov. Time was slipping away. Finally, after nearly an hour, he began drinking more. Still, the poison seemed to have no effect. Upstairs, the others were restless. "The poison isn't working," Yusupov hissed. He returned to the basement with a pistol. One sharp crack shattered the air. Rasputin fell, twitching, his breaths shallow. Certain they'd succeeded, the men moved to burn his clothes and destroy the evidence. But then footsteps. The basement door opened, and there, staggering into the courtyard like a specter, was Rasputin, still alive, eyes wild, moving toward the gate. Perishkevich grabbed his gun and chased him into the snow. Shots rang out misses. Two bystanders fled in panic. More shots. This time Rasputin collapsed in the icy dark, the life finally leaving him. It was over, or so they thought. They wrapped his body, drove through the silent city, and hurled him beneath the ice of the Petrovsky Bridge. By dawn they were back at the palace, cold and exhausted, unaware of the mistakes they'd made, the shoe left behind, the bloodstains in the courtyard. Within 2 days his body was found, frozen in the river. The entire country knew who had done it, but no arrests came. The Tsar feared that punishing the killers might ignite a political inferno. The men scattered, some fled Russia, some stayed, some died young. And Rasputin, even in death, remained what he had been in life, a figure of myth, scandal, and mystery. Yet that night in St. Petersburg, under the glow of palace lights and the bite of the winter wind, one truth stood out above all sometimes. Even when you kill a man, his shadow never really dies. The winter wind howled across the Neva River, rattling loose shutters and carrying whispers through the alleyways of St. Petersburg. News of Rasputin's murder spread with the speed and force of a storm. It didn't matter that no one had been formally accused. Everyone knew. The details, embellished and retold from cafe tables to factory floors, painted the night as something between a heroic act and a supernatural battle. For some, he had been a monster, an immoral, manipulative charlatan whose hands had tangled too tightly in the strings of the empire. For others, he was a holy man, misunderstood, targeted because of his closeness to the throne. That divide carved itself deep into Russian society and for the royal family, it was more than an embarrassment. It was a wound that would never quite heal. The Empress's grief was a force all its own. To her, Rasputin had been more than an advisor. He had been the one person she believed could keep her fragile son alive. In the corridors of the palace, she whispered that without Rasputin's prayers, the boy would not survive the winter. When the news reached her, the color drained from her face, and her hands shook so violently that a servant had to steady her tea. She demanded answers, demanded the killers be punished, but her pleas met a wall of hesitation from the Tsar. Nicholas II understood the danger. Russia was a nation teetering on the edge of revolution. Food shortages, military failures, and a public growing more restless with each passing week had the country simmering toward open rebellion. Punishing men like Yusupov, well-connected, aristocrats with allies in the military, could ignite the spark that would burn the empire to ash. And so he chose silence, allowing the killers to slip away without the consequences they should have faced. Yet silence did not mean safety. In the shadows, Rasputin's death had set something in motion. His enemies thought they had rid Russia of his influence, but in truth, the story of Rasputin only grew. The stranger-than-fiction circumstances of his final hours fed the rumor mill that he had been poisoned, shot, beaten, and still walked away. That his body under the ice had shown signs of water in the lungs, proving he had still been alive when he hit the river. These were not merely details, they were legend in the making. Meanwhile, the conspirators scattered. Yusupov, smug in his belief that he had saved Russia, found his life shrinking in ways he hadn't anticipated. Banished from the capital, he took refuge in his estates, and when the revolution came, he fled entirely. France became his exile and his prison. He lived among the exiled Russian nobility in Paris, a world of faded titles and empty fortunes, always keeping his name tethered to that one night, as if it were his greatest achievement. Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich also found himself cast out, wandering Europe like a man in permanent limbo. Purishkevich, ever the proud nationalist, stayed in Russia a while longer, but his health failed quickly. Dr. Lazavert vanished into obscurity, the kind of man who would never again be trusted in polite company. Lieutenant Sukotin drifted through the chaos of the revolution, his name remembered only in whispers among those who knew the truth. But what of the void Rasputin left behind? That was the part none of them had planned for. His death didn't strip the royal family of scandal, it exposed them even more. Without him as a lightning rod, the blame for Russia's troubles shifted directly onto Nicholas and Alexandra. The people, already suspicious of the Empress's German heritage during the war, began to call her a traitor in hushed but venomous tones. Rasputin's murder hadn't saved the monarchy, it had quickened its collapse. In the months that followed, Russia spiraled downward. Bread lines lengthened, soldiers deserted the front, and whispers of revolution grew into shouts. The newspapers that had once been fined for printing stories about Rasputin now splashed headlines about government incompetence and palace corruption. His murder became part of a broader narrative, the royal family's detachment, their blindness to the suffering of their people, their obsession with personal matters while the empire rotted beneath them. Somewhere in Paris, years later, Yusupov sat for interviews and wrote his memoirs, recounting the night of the murder with a mix of pride and theatrical flourish. He painted himself as the hero who had rid Russia of a parasite, glossing over the chaos, the mistakes, the fact that Rasputin had nearly walked away. His accounts were dramatic, filled with vivid details, some true, many imagined, feeding the West's fascination with the so-called mad monk. He had no idea that his own story, much like Rasputin's, would be dissected, doubted, and retold for decades to come. And Rasputin? Even in death, he refused to stay buried. His life and murder became the stuff of myth, reshaped by each person who told it. To peasants in remote villages, he was a martyr slain by jealous aristocrats. To the nobility, he remained a dangerous fraud who had nearly ruined the empire. To the revolutionaries, he was proof of the rot at the heart of the monarchy, a symptom of a system that needed to be torn down completely. The truth was more complicated, tangled between fact and legend, but complexity rarely survives in the public imagination. What lived on instead was the image, the wild-eyed peasant who rose to power on whispers of miracles, who dined with royalty and sinned in the shadows, who took poison, bullets, and ice before his body surrendered. The image was too powerful to fade, and in the turbulent years that followed, it became one of the enduring symbols of the empire's final days. In the long winter after his death, the palace corridors seemed colder, emptier. The empress would sometimes walk them at night, her footsteps echoing, convinced she could still hear his voice. She clung to the belief that his death was a turning point, not for the better, but toward the doom he had once warned her about. Rasputin had told her that if he died at the hands of nobles, the monarchy would fall within 2 years. It became a prophecy she could not shake. And so, even as Russia hurtled toward revolution, civil war, and the end of centuries of imperial rule, Rasputin's name never vanished. He was in the speeches of agitators, in the memoirs of exiles, in the gossip of markets, and the pages of foreign newspapers. His shadow stretched far beyond the icy courtyard where his body had collapsed, far beyond the hole in the river where they had tried to hide him. For Yusupov, for Purishkevich, for all the men who had conspired that winter night, there was an unspoken truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. Killing Rasputin had not erased his power, it had immortalized it. They had sought to destroy a man, but instead they had created a legend. And as the world around them changed, empires falling, borders shifting, wars reshaping continents, his ghost lingered, stubborn and unyielding, in the story of Russia itself. It was as if, in trying to silence him, they had guaranteed he would never stop speaking. Snow drifted across the Paris streets, softening the edges of the city, but inside a cramped apartment on the left bank, Felix Yusupov's life felt anything but soft. It had been years since that freezing night in St. Petersburg, yet the memories clung to him like smoke. He had fled Russia with his wife Irina, just ahead of the revolution's fury, carrying jewels sewn into the linings of coats, the last remnants of a fortune that once seemed untouchable. Now his days were spent in drawing rooms of exiled aristocrats, the air heavy with perfume and stories of a world that no longer existed. Everywhere he went, people wanted to hear it. The story. His story, the night they killed Rasputin. He told it with the precision of a stage actor, his pauses and inflections carefully placed, his descriptions vivid enough to make listeners lean in, as though they were standing in that candle-lit basement themselves. He relished the attention, but he could never quite shake one detail, that moment in the courtyard when Rasputin, shot and poisoned, had risen to his feet and tried to escape. That look in his eyes, not fear, not pain, something else. By then, the Romanovs were gone shot in a basement by Bolsheviks in the dead of night. Russia was a different world entirely. carved into something unrecognizable by civil war and the new, merciless rule of Lenin's Bolsheviks. The Empress's prophecy, Rasputin's prophecy, had come true. The monarchy had fallen within 2 years of his death, just as he said it would. The very people who once spat his name now whispered it in awe, as if he had been more oracle than man. The myth only grew. Books were written, plays were staged. Newspapers printed sensational accounts of his unholy influence, his rumored powers, the decadent and depraved scenes in his apartment. In cities from London to New York, audiences gawked at photographs of his piercing eyes, images that seemed to follow them from the page. The line between truth and legend dissolved completely, and Rasputin became something else, a figure too large to fit inside the narrow box of history. And then the letters started arriving. They were anonymous, postmarked from cities across Europe, Vienna, Berlin, Warsaw. Some praised Yusupov for his heroism. Others dripped with venom, calling him a murderer and coward. But the ones that unsettled him most were short, almost childlike in their simplicity. You cannot kill what is already eternal. The first time he read it, he laughed it off. By the 5th letter, he burned it in the fireplace without showing Irina. But the messages didn't stop. One icy February evening, years later, Yusupov was walking home through a dim Parisian street after a dinner with friends. The city was quiet, his breath hanging in the cold air. From somewhere behind him came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. He turned nothing. But as he walked again, the steps returned, closer this time. His heart began to pound. He ducked into a narrow alley, his shoes scraping against the wet cobblestones, the air smelling faintly of smoke and rain. Halfway down the alley, he froze. A man was standing at the far end, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat. The gaslight from the street barely reached his face, but the eyes, those eyes, caught the light and burned like 2 shards of ice. It was impossible. It could not be. The man stepped forward, slow, deliberate. His voice was low, almost a growl, and it stopped Yusupov's breath cold. "You left me in the ice, Felix." The world tilted. The alley spun. The weight of that night in 1916 came crashing back in an instant. The gunshot, the twitching body, the staggering escape, the last breath in the snow. And yet, here he was, or something wearing his face. Yusupov stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the slick stones. "You're dead," he whispered, his voice trembling. The man's mouth curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "Am I?" A deafening sound split the air. Not the quiet crack of a pistol like that winter night, but an explosive, gut-shaking bang that echoed off the alley walls and rolled through the sleeping streets. Windows shattered. Car alarms screamed to life. Yusupov's vision went white, and the ground rushed up to meet him. When the police arrived minutes later, the alley was empty, no sign of a struggle. No trace of blood, just a single wet footprint leading toward the river. And for the rest of his life, Yusupov never again spoke of the night he heard Rasputin's voice in the dark.